So I want to talk about self-directed learning material, or how do we actually write this documentation stuff. We just heard about how to build. So first of one observation I've made is that we all kind of suffer from edtech amnesia, I call it, or other people on the internet call it, because there's a huge body of research on this whole kind of how to teach people and how to okay. How to teach people how to learn stuff effectively. And so essentially we don't know shit about this whole how to do education thing. And per inference, also I don't know shit, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. So when I researched this talk, I was trying to look at like this whole field of didactics and stuff, and there's a huge amount of, or a huge body of research on it, and which is so wildly arcane to us as technical people that I thought about including it in my talk, but ultimately didn't, because it would be kind of faking it, right? So what instead I did is I just wrote down what I do and what I learned doing this education stuff. And is this kind of green? Can we kind of fix the colors or something? Okay, great, cool. Blue, white. Check.
Do you have flux?
Please try to unplug it and then unplug it. Unplug it and plug it again.
Yay! Thank you. Okay, so I don't know shit about this, but I've done some. The background I have is I'm from the Open Tech School. We do workshops, so free programming workshops, where we try to teach people the basics and the concepts of programming. There's two catches to it. The first is all the material we write is written collaboratively, so it's not like one person, like we've heard that most docs are written by one person, one technical writer, and we have the problem or the opportunity to create it in a community fashion. And also, all the workshops we do is then people working through the material and having coaches stand by the sidelines to help them if they have any problems or are stuck with the material. So I'm going to talk quickly about the coaching stuff at the end of my talk. So first off, this collaboration, how do we do it? What have we found to be useful and necessary in order to collaborate? One thing which I've heard in several other talks here as well is that you need clear goals. Like you need to define where you want to go with the material. So is it, what is the goal? What do you want to teach? What are the main objectives of the material? One distinction you have to make, and which is very, very important, is that there's a huge difference between tutorials and references. So references are trying to make clear some kind of API and are trying to, I don't know, enumerate all function calls your programming library has or something. But tutorials are different in that they don't need to be exhaustive or need to be complete, but they try to be conscious and that they explain some concept and that they get across a point so that you as the reader understand the very concept. So for one of our materials, we had this discussion. It is some material about JavaScript, teaching people how to do programming using JavaScript. And one thing we had to agree on at the very beginning was that, so the example in this, or the example project in this material is that people are building a slideshow. So it's a web page and there are images and you can scroll through the slideshow and all that kind of stuff. And the one thing people and all writers have to understand is that the goal of this material is not actually building a slideshow. So if you come and say, yeah, a slideshow should have infinite scrolling and it should use this great design pattern and use MVC and whatnot, this is not a useful thing to say. Because if you're trying to teach someone JavaScript or programming basics, like what is a loop, what is a conditional, then thinking about what is useful in a slideshow is not going to bring you towards the learning objectives you have. One thing we've observed is that this collaboration thing is actually harmful for what we are trying to do. So when there's many people, the chances of somebody coming and saying, we should do design pattern X, best practice Y, or something, then you have to actively say, no, this is outside of the scope of our project, or outside of the scope of the learning material. So what we found useful is having some kind of champion or maintainer for your documentation, right? So that you can say, okay, it is a good idea, maybe we want to add a link to that nice proposal, but it's outside of the scope of this learning objective. So one example which just occurred to me recently was we have one tutorial on data processing in Python, so how to munch data and stuff. And so somebody came and said, yeah, all this kind you're teaching, all the stuff you're teaching the people is nice, but in Python you usually use the with statement to open and close files. And then we had to say, yeah, this is true, but this is going to confuse people because like they don't even know what functions are or what blocks are or something, and then you're trying to teach them some new statement when they just recently learned what files are and how to open and close files. So this is something which you have to defer or reject for material, because this is not useful in teaching them how to do programming. One thing we've talked about at this conference as well here is using the right tools. So what we found to be incredibly useful is using very lightweight tools. So we're using Jekyll and Sphinx, which both feature very lightweight markup, so Markdown and research text. And we hosted on GitHub Pages, which we heard about in the previous talk. So we are trying to keep the overhead in writing the material very low so that that is not an additional obstacle in the collaboration process. One thing which has been incredibly hard for us, and we have not found a good solution for it as well, but we have identified the problem, is that when you're trying to teach people programming, you quickly run into the dependency hell, right? You have to, okay, in order to draw a rectangle with Python, you have to install Python, you have to install pip, you have to install Python TK, but only if you're on Ubuntu, but only if you're not on Ubuntu 64 bits. This is really confusing to people. Like if they don't even know how to create a Python script file on their machine, they're pretty overwhelmed by installing additional packages and stuff. So try to be very extensive in your instructions on how to set up stuff. One thing we have tried and succeeded, especially with kids, is supplying live systems for them. So preparing some kind of system image, which we can give to them and saying, hey, this is like, you can stick it into your machine and boot it up, and then you will have a Linux machine or something, and it has all the packages you need, and you can just write your stuff on it and like run the programs, and it will work out of the box, mostly. Yeah, so this is one thing we have done and found to help a little bit in the dependency whole stuff. So now let me talk about the actual content stuff. Like the previous stuff was about how to collaborate and how to prepare the infrastructure for the material, but how do we now actually write it? So one thing, especially when thinking about this goal definition we did for the material, is you have to begin with one easy trick is to begin with the end in mind. So let's say you want to write material on teaching people how to do loops. And you would begin with a chapter explaining loops, and then you would use variables and conditionals in there, and then you say, oh, okay, we have not explained variables and conditionals, so let's backtrack from there and add a chapter before explaining variables and loops, variables and conditionals. So that's something we found to be a very good approach to writing stuff. Also something we have found learners to like about material if it considers their both basic needs. So they want to, first off, they want to make something, so they want to achieve something and go very little steps towards doing something themselves and building something or seeing something they have built. And it usually makes them very happy to see, oh wow, I have told the computer to draw a rectangle, and it just did that. And now I've told it to change the color to green, and it changed the color, great. But then on the other side, you always have to give people like to be, or people learning to program like to be instructed. So take them by the hand and tell them, okay, do this and that, and then they'll go here, and then write this. And maybe also supply solutions which they can just copy-paste. To you as programmers, this might seem counterintuitive because, hey, they are just copy-pasting, and how would they ever learn something? But we found that especially if we encourage them to experiment with the snippets we give them, like, here, look, this is a snippet to draw a rectangle, now change the color. Then they will usually do that, and they will kind of appreciate and still learn the basic concepts behind it. One measure we found to be very effective is like letting them feel pain, not actual physical pain, at least not too much, but kind of psychological warfare pain, so to say. So let me, this is all very abstract, let me give you an example. So in one material, and this is my favorite example of doing this technique, is in the Python for Beginners material, we have an exercise telling the beginners, hey, draw a rectangle, and the beginner will go and happily write down this chunk of code there, where they just draw one edge of the rectangle, then turn, draw the other edge, yada yada, whatever. Then the next exercise is draw 3 rectangles. So most, wait a second. So so they will go and copy paste the stuff and have 3 rectangles, right? And the next exercise is the mean one. We go and say, hey, now make the rectangles twice as large. And now, if they want to solve this exercise, they need to go into every single edge of the 3 exercises. This is like 4 times 3, so that's 12 digits they need to change. And they need to change the code in 12 different places, and that's really painful for them. And they see, oh gosh, this is so stupid, why am I doing this? And this is a perfect opportunity to introduce loops to them. So you can say, hey, if you would have written a loop, you would only have to change one single point in your code, or if you have, also you could introduce variables with the very same concept. So if you try to make them feel how or why a concept is useful and why it can kind of reduce the pain or help them program more effectively, then they will mostly understand why this concept is useful to them. Another thing we have struggled with in our material is the amount of repetition. So we found that repeating stuff is good on one hand, like so one example I have is in Python there is a built-in help thing, and you can quit it or you can enter it, and then you have to quit it by pressing the Q key. And in our tutorial, people will enter this prompt at different times in the material. So they might enter it at the very beginning if they are very curious, or they might only enter it if in a very advanced exercise if they only know most of the stuff or have a good intuition about it. So we would have to go and add the hint with, hey, if you entered this prompt and you don't know how to quit it, press Q. We would have to add it to every single occurrence of where they could possibly enter the help thing. And what that did, so we have done that, and what that did to people is they just skipped those little boxes with hints in them, even if it was a very different hint. So you have to find some kind of, we don't know the answer here as well, so you have to find some kind of balance between repeating yourself and also not repeating yourself, so that people still read the stuff you actually write. And lastly, perhaps most obvious, is that images tend to help people to make sense of what you're saying. So even if it's just like if you're giving them an introduction to terminals, just have an image of a terminal, because they will see, oh yeah, this is the same thing I have, or it looks very similar. There's text and there's like black background, white text, it looks familiar. I'm on the right track. I want to quickly say something about translations, because we've spoken about that here at the conference as well. We at the Open Text School are using the same tandem Marcus has introduced already. We're using Sphinx. And we are then publishing our source material to Transifex, and people come and translate it. And the really great thing is that we have, so initially we published our Python for Beginners material to Transifex. And we needed translations for a kids workshop in 3 weeks or something. And then someone came, some contributor came and translated the whole material. It is, I don't know, like 20, 30 pages of programming speak, and he translated it to German in 3 days or something. That was incredible. And the same happened for Spanish, and is now happening for Russian for us. So just putting the stuff out there and having community contributors come and do stuff for you is really great. One thing you have to consider is, if you are using some kind of markup, then give the translators instructions. So for example, when we had our first translation, we had like these restructured text instructions in there, right? So you can say, you can mark up inline text by giving it a role, and then having backticks, and then a text. One of the translators apparently had bad eyesight or something, and mistook the backticks for normal apostrophes. So he did all the translations with apostrophes instead of, so single quotation marks instead of backticks, which screwed up the whole build process and did not let things render anymore. Because we failed to give them instructions like, hey, if you encounter this colon, roll, colon, backtick thing, then watch out, it's a backtick. Another thing we have found is that when you are, especially when you are translating material as the original writer of it, or as a programmer, or someone who would also improve the material, then try to never, ever, 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 ever change or diverge in the translation from the source material. So let's say you have some text, and when translating, you notice, I could express this much better, and I'm just going to do this in the translation. I can go back to the source material later, but you won't. So do not ever try to improve text in the translations, but rather change the source material so the source material and all other translations can benefit.